Tomorrow, October 6th, 2010, the members of the United States Supreme Court will come together to hear the arguments of two opposing sides. One, a father claiming that the right to bury his son, a fallen soldier, in peace and dignity has been directly violated. And the other, a zealous religious group who has deemed it their First Amendment right to picket and protest at the funerals of dead soldiers in order to convey their message. This is the case of Phelps versus Snyder, where the limits of one of our nation's most sacred constitutional rights will be put to the test. The specific details of the events of March 10th, 2006, in Westminster, Maryland, vary depending on who you ask, but 2 points can unanimously be agreed upon. One, that this was in fact the day of Lance Corporal Matthew A. Snyder's funeral, and two, that the members of the Westboro Baptist Church were present to protest that funeral. Mr. Albert Snyder, the father of Lance Corporal Matthew A. Snyder, a United States Marine who had only recently lost his life serving his country in Iraq, recounted the events of that day with me.
Because of the presence of the Westboro Church, the funeral procession had to be rerouted. And the funeral procession came within probably 200 to 300 feet of the protesters. I saw the signs, the tops of the signs, but I did not see what the signs said. There was no way at this point that I was going to leave my son's body to go look at signs depicting two men having anal intercourse, or signs that said, "You're in hell," or signs that said, "God hates you," and Semper Fi fags. If anybody thinks I should have left my son's body to go read the signs that I saw the tops of, they've got to be out of their mind. You know, don't think they didn't interrupt the funeral. I had to have a SWAT team there. There was policemen there. There were state policemen there. There were county sheriffs there. There were reporters coming out of the woodwork because of the announcement that they sent out that had a picture of Matt, called Matt by name, had a military casket. Underneath the military casket, it said "Burial of an Ass." And then it went on to proceed that they would be protesting at St. John's Catholic Dog Kennel. If that's not interrupting a funeral, what is? They turned the entire environment outside that church into a circus.
Based out of Topeka, Kansas, the Westboro Baptist Church, headed by Pastor Fred Phelps, has been actively protesting against homosexuality since the early 1990s. Though it was not till 2005 that the church began to picket the funerals of American soldiers. With its some 60 members, mostly made up of Pastor Phelps' extended family, the Westboro Baptist Church, to date, has claimed to have participated in over 41,000 protests in over 650 cities around the United States, averaging a yearly budget of $250,000. Mrs. Shirley Roper, one of Pastor Fred Phelps' daughters, lawyer and spokesman for the Westboro Baptist Church, when interviewed, had this to say about the picket of Matthew A. Snyder's funeral.
First of all, by the time that funeral started, we were gone. That's the way we rolled. We've been to more than 500 of these death events, but the law enforcement people hooked up with the priest, and they picked the place where we stood. We couldn't see that church, and we never saw the funeral procession. We didn't see anybody. It was like crickets and corn. You know what I'm saying? They had us in the North 40. Nobody going to that funeral even saw us. And by the way, it's not unlawful for the family members to see us. We were on a public right-of-way. And when it came time for the funeral to start, as per our custom, we leave.
A few weeks after the funeral, while searching the internet for postings about his son, Matthew, Mr. Snyder happened upon an essay that had been written by Mrs. Shirley Roper of the Westboro Baptist Church.
One morning, I went on and I saw this thing called The Burden of Lance Corporal Matthew Snyder, and I thought, what is this? And when I opened it up, I got the shock of my life. It stated that I had raised Matt for the devil. It stated that I had taught him divorce. It taught that I had taught him to refer to God as a liar. It said I taught him adultery. And it called me out by name. And it called Matt out by name. It was targeted. This picket was targeted. They picked me out. They chose to come to Matt's funeral from halfway across the country. I didn't go to their church. They came to mine.
I put those words out there unapologetically to tell this nation and every person who reads those words the standards of God and what you've done to bring what is today your imminent destruction upon you and your children. He didn't have to read that document. And so the point is, though, that if the government is going to impose any restriction on speech, they have to have time, place, and manner restriction.
Mr. Snyder then proceeded to file a lawsuit against Pastor Fred Phelps and the other members of the Westboro Baptist Church who had picketed the funeral. His claim in the suit was that of invasion of privacy and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. After making its way through the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, the case has ultimately been accepted for review by the United States Supreme Court. On September 27, 2010, a public forum was held at the University of Kansas Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics in honor of Constitution Day. The theme of the meeting was entitled, "Is Nothing Sacred? Snyder versus Phelps and Free Speech." Stephen McAllister and Christina Wells were invited to be the authority guest speakers at the event. Stephen McAllister, the Solicitor General of Kansas and professor of law at the University of Kansas, spoke in defense of the Snyder side of the case. Christina Wells, the Enoch H. Chowder Professor of Law at the University of Missouri and a First Amendment scholar, spoke in favor of the Phelps and their right to free speech.
What's at issue is partly suggested by perhaps the title of this program, Is Nothing Sacred? Is there no limit to what people can say, where they can say it, when they can say it in the United States? And I think that's sort of a big picture issue. I mean, the Phelpses can do this and basically walk away from it with no legal responsibility when, frankly, they are targeting a private event. They are targeting a private family. They are doing it because they know the attention it gets.
The free speech jurisprudence that already exists allows the government to regulate a lot of disturbing and invasive protest activity already. So the crux of this is whether or not a group of people who stood more than 500 feet away, who obeyed all police directives, and who by all accounts protested relatively peacefully, and by the way, the plaintiff in this case, the father of the unfortunate young man who was killed, whose father didn't even see the signs until several days later or hours later at a funeral protest or at a news broadcast or on the web, whether that is considered to be disruptive of a funeral.
I think certainly the argument that's made on the Phelps' side of the case is if they lose, this is the end of free speech as we know it. I don't buy that. If the outcome is the Phelpses are held liable, it's not the end of the world. It may be the end of their world, but it's not the end of the world for America or for public discourse or freedom of speech in this country.
I do think that if Mr. Snyder were to win on these facts with the standards that he wants, it would be very bad for free speech law because it has the potential to destabilize really important foundational aspects of free speech law. And this is where this case really isn't about Mr. Snyder or the Phelps. It's about what the court has said in terms of being able to protect offensive speech and really having this very strong antipathy toward viewpoint censorship.
I don't want to take anybody's First Amendment rights away. My son died for him. And if the Phelps want to protest when they go to the Supreme Court, good for them, because that's their right and that's where they should be protesting. Take it to the courts. Take it to the government. Don't bring it to a 20-year-old's funeral who has no control over any changes in the military or with government policy. This case wasn't about free speech. It was about harassment before, during, and after Matt's funeral.
These sidewalks, these public rights-of-way, are held in trust by local units of government for robust public debate, and that is what we're doing. What I'm saying is, if this case can stand, we don't have any First Amendment left in this country.
And so the question is posed, should there be limits to your First Amendment right of free speech in this nation? Or does anything go? This has been Isaac Gwynn, reporting for As Heard from the Hill.